Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here today. I think we probably have all levels in here. And for anyone who watches the UX Research and Strategy LinkedIn feed, you probably see the reoccurring bias, cognitive bias posts that are posted up there, which I think are fantastic. So hopefully some review today, maybe some new things. Looking forward to going through it and seeing what questions we have at the end. So we'll go ahead and dig in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is why biases are important. Where do they come from? Why are they affecting us in the first place? How did they get there? We're going to talk about how they fit into your work next, research primarily with a little bit of design, and then we'll get into some debiasing techniques. So to understand bias, we have to start by talking about the brain, right? Where did they come from and why do we have them? So we're going to start with some metaphors and maybe a little bit of oversimplification to make it easier to understand. So we'll start by talking about decisions. Biases are a key feature of our brain that allows us to be super efficient into making thousands of decisions every single day. A lot of overload, especially in our current time when you've got social media and you've got smartphones and you've got triggers happening constantly and Slack and email. And we may be a little over allocated, but we get through it. And we're able to do this because of this processing that we're going to talk about. So you can think about this guy standing here at the counter. He needs to figure out what he's going to order. He's got social influences. He, at some point, had to decide what restaurant to go to in the first place. Many of these are unimportant routine decisions, but we have to get through them. So various sources suggest that the average adult makes 33,000 to 35,000 total decisions every single day. And that could be what we wear, what we're going to eat, what shoes we're going to put on, what we're going to say next, how we're going to say it. It's a lot to go through. In addition, not only are we making those decisions, but we also have a lot of other stuff happening with our brain at the same time. We have to pay attention to our surroundings, what's going on around us. This woman is going through a very busy intersection. What she sees, maybe somebody passes by her on a motorbike. How does that make her feel? What are the social aspects going on around her and the context? Is it a safe situation? How does she feel about that? And so on. So our brain is programmed to handle this automatically. It's happening through information that's subconsciously stored in our brain that we've determined is good or bad. And it does this using general rules of thumb. So rules of thumb is something I've used before. And one day somebody asked me, like, what is a rule of thumb? And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I just kind of thought it's one of those, a rule of thumb is a rule of thumb. Everybody knows what a rule of thumb is. So let's talk about that a little bit. A rule of thumb is a rough estimate. It's not an exact science. And there's a number of stories about where this originally came from. Essentially, roughly from the end of your thumb down to your hand is about 1 inch from the top to the knuckle is what it says. Now, if I told you this is exactly 1 inch on everybody, you probably wouldn't believe me and you would be good not to believe me because it's not going to be the same on everybody. But it's about 1 inch. And that's exactly the point of a rule of thumb. It's a general, close enough, rough estimate. And this is kind of how our subconscious works. It has these general rules. But then there's another part. It takes these general rules and it adds in some associations and then some context. So I work at Seesaw Learning. This is a company that does educational platforms for students K through 2. So I think in worksheets a lot. So this is a great worksheet to think of context, right? I don't think there's many people on this call who are going to look at the spider and be like, yep, that totally goes with the snowman and the book bag and the leaf 100%, right? We probably all have very strong associations between these objects and we could fill out this worksheet very quickly. These are learned associations. You don't just know them innately. And then the context does change what the association is. For example, maybe the spider belongs in the tree, but there's a certain context to this worksheet that is setting things up. So now think about this. If I asked you about ski masks and if they're good or are they bad, your initial reaction might change if I give you one context. I say, what do you think about the ski mask? Versus if I give you another context. What do you think about people wearing ski masks? It's the same ski mask, right? But it completely changes the immediate associations that come to the back of your head. What if I gave you this apple? You came over and I was like, hey, I prepared this scrumptious little dish for you. I'm so excited for you to try it. Your gut reaction would probably be that I'm crazy and I'm losing it because you're not going to eat this apple. Why would I serve you this apple? It doesn't take a lot of thought to understand this is not going to be a good situation. Doesn't require much. That's because our brain is programmed with all of these associations and we learn them throughout our life. And we have connections on hundreds and millions of things in our brain, all wired together to guide us with default answers based on the context we're in and the associations that are going on in that moment. So think about maybe for those of you that drive to work, it's been quite a few years for me, but or a routine drive or maybe daycare or something, going to the gym, something you do on a regular basis. Have you ever driven there and then you realize when you get there, I don't totally remember getting here. I had something on my mind and I was focusing on that. And I'm sure I stopped at the stoplights and I don't think I caused I don't think I ran any lights, but I just don't quite remember that. It's because we've gone on autopilot, because we've done something many times and it's familiar. And we can do that somewhat without a lot of conscious attention. We shouldn't do that. I'm not recommending it, but it can happen. So you can think of this subconscious mind kind of like a robot or like a Roomba. For any of you that have them, I have an older one and it gets stuck on dark carpet and it has fallen down the stairs once. They're not supposed to do that. Every now and then it can't find its home again and it runs out of battery and it dies. Generally, it does a very good job. It has a map of the house. It cleans what it's supposed to clean. I can tell my Echo to turn it on and it knows the rules and it can follow the rules. But there are things that this robot just sometimes gets tripped up on, right? So when you think about our subconscious decision making, we have all these millions of amazing associations and it allows us to process just so much complex information at one time, but it's still running off of very basic rules. So this is kind of a good way to think about it. A decision comes to you, it is presented to you, something you need to make a decision on. And this kind of robot goes and looks at the rules that you've learned and says, okay, what's the context? Okay, where's the scheme? Where are we when the scheme X is presented to us? And then now what are our associations based on our context? And then it gives you your instinct kind of default response that you move forward with. So Gerald Zaltman is a Harvard Business School professor that suggests that 95%, I think that's an astounding number, of our cognition occurs in the subconscious mind. Think about that for a minute. That's are we involved at all, right? So this is by necessity. Our brains would shortcut if we had to have more than 30,000 decisions one by one. Think about how many decisions we make in a day and how quickly we become overwhelmed. 30,000 is a massive number. Other estimates put this closer to 80%, but either way, what about the other 5%? I think is a good question. So here's the other 5%. This is how we like to think of ourselves. This is how we like to think all of our work is happening, right? We're really concentrating, we're paying attention, we're solving problems, we're kind of, I was trying to think of what that movie is, Good Will Hunting, right? Where he's doing all the math on the board. These are the effortful decision problem-based things, and this is the 5%. So we're gonna call this our expert. This is the expert part of our brain. The expert works hard to take a problem and to figure out a decision and get you an actual answer. There is no rule of thumb here. This is exact measurements. It takes energy, it takes focus, it takes active participation, and this is your critical thinking. There are some caveats to this though, this work required to do this complex math. This isn't just gonna do it like the robot does. You have to use focus to get there. And for anyone who's ever sat down and really focused, I'm sure you can relate to the feeling of exhaustion that comes from that focus. It'll literally make us feel exhausted. I've definitely encountered this even in my walks. I take morning walks about a mile every morning, and sometimes I listen to audiobooks, and I will find myself stopped in the middle of the path because I can't process what I got to back it up. I got to listen to that again. Can't walk and think at the same time. I have to slow down because it's too much. So we do have a finite bucket of stamina for this type of mental work. And if you don't have the mental bandwidth, guess what happens? the robot will take over and just give you the rule of thumb answer, and you may not even realize it. So if you're starting to feel exhausted, you're starting to feel overwhelmed in what you're doing, that's a good chance that you may not be using the expert brain anymore. There's a really cool study around this, some judicial rulings by Israeli judges that, imagine you're a judge, right? You spend all day taking cases, sitting in the same room, all sorts of information. Well, they found that the judges gave more lenient decisions at the start of the day and after meal breaks. So prisoners are 2 times to 6 times more likely to be released if they're one of the first 3 after a break versus the last 3 after a break. Why is that? Because the judges replenished their glucose stores. They had a snack, they had some food, they came in after breakfast, they came back after lunch. Now, you could argue that's kind of a sad state of affairs in the process overall, but it's also very illuminating to see how much impact glucose has on your ability to use expert judgment. Unfortunately, as humans, we put too much faith in the accuracy of our intuition because overriding the robot takes work. Just by the pure nature of what the robot is, it takes work to override it. And so we can't constantly question ourselves all day, every day, 30, 35,000 decisions. We would never get anywhere. So in order for it to be able to do what it does, we need to have faith in it. So now we have a bit of a modified model. So we've got kind of our robot autopilot takes the context and the associations and is ready to go through unless we feel we need the expert. And if we do need the expert to come in and pay attention, we first have to see if the energy exists. Do we have the mental stamina and fortitude right now to do that kind of thinking and processing? And if we do, then we'll go forward. Otherwise, it goes back to autopilot. So automatic shortcuts allow us to make decisions quickly, but impact our ability to make rational decisions. So depending on how good your associations and context are, that might bite you. I don't know if y'all can see this. It's hard when you don't have a live audience. So I don't know if everyone's catching this one, but this poor woman is standing behind 3 mannequins and not an actual checkout line. So can't say I probably haven't done something like that in my life. Here's a couple other fun ones. What do you put in a toaster? I'm guessing at least a couple people said toast, duh. You put bread in a toaster and then it becomes toast. If a red house is made with red bricks, a blue house is made with blue bricks, a pink house is made with pink bricks, and a black house is made with black bricks, what is a greenhouse made of? Glass. And then one more fun one. If the hour hand on a clock moves 1/60th of a degree every minute, how many degrees will the hour hand move in 1 hour? And the answer is 1 degree. Now, I don't know if anyone noticed that the last one was the hardest. It's because it involves math, which is harder for us to do estimates with. Think about your systematic shortcuts and the way math works. It's not something you typically practice every single morning, unless it's rote memorization like 2 + 2. So our autopilot biases are just systematic errors. There are hundreds of ways that we could get inadvertently caught up. This is a great codex. You can find it online. There are 4 key types of errors within this codex, and they are adding more all the time. The first one is not knowing what information is important. Like, what should I pay attention to? I'm getting overwhelmed with all this stuff. What are the bullet points? One is time and social. Like, I need to do this fast. I need to make a decision right now. I don't have the time to go through it all. One is having too much information as a whole. There's just a lot to sort through. And then the last one is not having enough context. Because even if we can create associations, we need to have that context in order to put it into perspective. So similar to what I just said about the math, as designers and researchers, we can call on the expert and we can cue the expert in our research. So for example, if I ask someone, how likely is it that you will XYZ? It will likely be answered by autopilot because I've just asked your brain to give me an estimated judgment. If I ask you, how many times in the last day did you will more likely call on the expert because I have just prompted you to give me correct math, an exact answer. So when we think about the way that we even phrase a question, we can cue different parts, different types of responses in the brain. So quick review of the kind of intro of what these biases are. We have our expert. So this is effortful and conscious, slow, but controlled and reliable and gets it right. And then we have our kind of robot autopilot, which is super fast and automatic and subconscious and makes most of the decisions for us, but also impulsive and error prone. Okay, so go ahead and continue to the next section here. This is getting into the meat of it. So we're going to talk about sample biases in research and design. I'm going to go through 4 different sections, although I would say facilitation is by far the heaviest. I just have a couple in the others, but I think it shows this shows up everywhere. It shows up how we recruit. It shows up how we facilitate, I think, the most, how we do our results, and how we approach our designs. And so it's important to keep it in mind at all stages of the work that we're doing. So for recruiting, we'll do some high level selection bias and self-selection bias. So we spoke to users from our ambassador program. Take a moment and think about, that sounds biased. What could be wrong with that? That's very common in business, right? We elicit specific user groups of expert users to help us make decisions on a regular basis. Unfortunately, that's selection bias. When our participant pool doesn't reflect the intended population as it should, our ambassadors likely have in-depth information and understanding of our software and how our company works, and are likely to give us maybe different answers. This is also seen in WEIRD research. A fun little acronym for anyone who's not familiar. It means Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Basically, people who are a part of Stanford studies and things like that. It tends to be a male population predominantly in the early 20s, but lots of research happens in that space. So the question is, how much does that research actually apply to a broader population? We also see this in medical research, where historically there's weighting towards male over female participants. So selection bias is something definitely be careful of, making sure that you're getting a good target population for what you're researching. All right, next one. We ran an online survey to assess access to technology. Aside from the irony, think about how that one might be. So similar to the last, but in this situations, we're talking about the people who ended up being sampled from our selected population. So this comes up a lot in recruiting platforms. They tend to attract certain types of users. If you're trying to assess access to technology, people without access aren't going to be able to be in your sample because they don't have the access to begin with. So maybe a better option would be balancing that with some sort of non-technological approach, since this is an online survey, using mixed methods, making sure that you're actually getting to the full representative population you're trying to target. And here's a fun little, I like all the little cartoons. People who love responding to surveys, of course, responded. And people who don't, didn't. And so they felt that everyone loves to respond to surveys. Totally. All right, facilitation. So we have 8 here. And like I said, there are hundreds, right? I just picked my favorites. The ones that I see myself most often with my team and with other people being like, let's watch for that. So I'm sure there are some good ones that come up in your research practices that maybe I didn't add, but just a sample to go through. How would you go about buying a new car? What could be wrong with this question? So this one is serial position effect. The bias here is that it's very future oriented. So our autopilot is making guesses based on past situations about what we might do in a major purchase. And we tend to be future oriented in a very positive light. We always assume the future is going to be better than it was. So something else I like to do about this would be, or a nice workshop example I like to do around this when I'm in a live audience, is to ask people to tell me about what you did this morning. How did you get ready this morning? Give me all the details, right? even then, inevitably somebody will forget something like they won't say they brushed their teeth, or they won't say they put their shoes on, or they won't say they turned off their alarm clock. And that doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? So there's actually a number of biases going on here. It's kind of a 2-for-1. It takes into recency and it takes into primacy, which is our ability to remember things that happened at the beginning. But essentially, a better way to do this would be let's write down some Post-it notes, a step you took when you decided to buy a new car, or when you're deciding to buy a new car. So you're getting someone who's doing this in process. They're writing it down as they're going. They're walking through it, and they have representation in the world that will help trigger things that maybe they forgot to mention. What problems did you have when you signed up last year? So this is pretty similar to the last one. This question relies a bit too much on memory. We tend to fill in missing gaps with stories, and Autopilot is fantastic at putting those stories together for us and convincing us of their detail. So recall bias occurs when participants do not remember accurately previous events, or omit details, or change the facts. So a better way might be, as a new user, I'd like to observe you as you sign up for this product for the first time. This is not the same as forgetfulness. It's just a difference in the importance of what they remember being altered. So try to get as close as possible to the actual event when asking questions. And then leveraging records and other things you can to help create a fuller picture. So both of those examples would be better observed. The information, this is a great quote by Jim Ross, the information provided during interviews isn't always accurate or reliable. Often research participants don't know why they do things, what they really need, or what they might do in the future, or how a design could be improved. To understand people, you cannot just ask them, you have to observe them. So that's the other thing with these last two, is they were both asked things that rely on a lot of self-report. All right, so moving into the next section here. How well did you like the updated navigation? Said in a very positive tone. This is framing. So feedback is influenced by the way information is presented, especially depending on the facilitator and how peppy you're feeling that day. You might be biasing them with the framing of your voice, but then also how well did you like it is very framed towards the positive. They didn't ask like or dislike. There wasn't any neutral in this question. We can be primed by many aspects of things like this. Let me see here. I have a written example here. Let me review this one. I forgot that I wrote this. Oh yeah, I forgot about this. This game where they found that if you put a participant around natural objects, like a backpack and a pencil and cardboard, and then you put another participant around business objects, like a briefcase, a leather portfolio, or a fancy pen, and then you bring both participants into the same room and assign one $10 to split or keep. 100% of the people primed with nature will split the money, and 100% of people in the business will keep half the money. So even the type of room that you're in can affect the questions, the framing of how people are going to respond to those questions. We really think you'll love the changes. What do you think? So this one I put under social desirability bias. Participants tend to answer in ways that they think will be most socially acceptable. Technically, this one's researcher bias, I think, to some extent. They're kind of leading the witness towards a positive response. But that goes back to the fact that many of these biases overlap. They're not black and white themselves. There are a lot of things that you could look at, and you could probably attach 5 or 6 different biases to it, depending on how you're looking at it. Here's a really fun video. This is my favorite. I hope it will play okay. Kara, if you can let me know if you see maybe a thumbs up when you hear audio.
Okay.
By the way, I don't know if you heard about this, but the future of footwear is here because Nike today unveiled what they're calling the first ever self-lacing basketball shoe. This is a shoe whose laces you control with an app with your phone. It's called Adapt BB. They'll sell for $350. This is the reality Back to the Future predicted, right down to Biff being the most powerful man in the world. The way the shoes work is it's really easy. You just download the app, you create an account, create a password and a user ID, you sync it to your shoes, and then you just tap your phone until you have the perfect fit, or you could just tie your own damn shoelaces. It's for basketball. They gave them at an NBA game tonight. It's gonna be awkward when LeBron tells the coach he can't play because he forgot to charge his shoes the night before. You have to charge these shoes around every 2 weeks. But what if you forgot until next month? But we came up with a fun idea. We went out on the street this afternoon and we asked people if they wanted to test the new self-lacing shoes out. Except we didn't give them self-lacing shoes. We gave them a pair of regular Nike slip-ons. Then we had to tell us if they could feel the laces tightening, even though there were no laces in the shoe to tighten. And I'll be honest, one of our writers came up with this idea this morning. I was like, this is not going to work. Nobody's going to believe this. I'm both happy and ashamed to say every single person who tried them fell for it in tonight's edition of Live Witness News.
So the way these work is they're controlled by an app.
Okay.
And so when I press right and left, each shoe is going to lace up. So I'm
Okay.
pressing the right one. Let me know when you feel it. Are you feeling it tightening on the right?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that feel good?
Yes, it does.
Okay. I'm going to switch to the left.
Okay.
So
Are you
remember,
feeling that?
these
Yeah.
shoes
Oh,
don't
yeah,
do
yeah, yeah, you
anything.
can feel it. It just adjusts
They're
to your
just
foot.
shoes.
It it hugs your foot, basically. It's what it feels like. They feel really comfortable.
So you think it does a better job than if you were to lace it yourself?
Easier job.
So I'm going to press on the right foot and you just tell me how it feels. Do you feel it tightening?
Yeah,
What does it
Yeah.
feel like?
it's just definitely getting tighter, and you can feel. I have really wide feet, so you can tell it definitely forms to your foot a lot better.
And there's also a reflexology mode, which will give your feet a little bit of a massage. So do you mind trying that
Yeah.
as well?
It almost feels warm, or like not a vibrating, but you can tell that it's moving around a little bit.
And does it feel good?
Yeah,
I feel it just kind of like it's almost like suctioning up against my ankles and securing them in place.
There's also a feature that has some heat. If you want to try that also,
Yeah.
you can press on that. It should be, the heat comes from the ball of your foot in that area. I don't know if you feel it.
Yeah, I feel a little warming sensation.
Yeah. How does that feel?
It's interesting. I've never felt that in a sneaker before. So
There's also a cooling feature for the summertime. So I'm just going to switch it to that.
yeah, and you can kind of feel that transition
Yeah.
from the heat to the cooling. So that's awesome.
a lot of the problem I have with my toes being cold in the front.
There's actually a special toe warming function if you didn't want heat all around. So I can turn that on too if you want to see if that makes a difference. It's sort of just like a little bit of a boost.
Oh, I feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Does it feel good?
yeah, it does.
You feel it tightening?
A little, yeah.
What does it feel like?
Jimmy.
It's like a slight squeeze, but I feel like it feels like which feels really great. I have like really high arches.
So what is going on there? If you think about, if you're a researcher, even if you had real shoes, I mean, these shoes didn't do anything at all. They were fake shoes. And yet they've got a whole series of individuals reporting how fantastically these shoes work. And you think about going back and researching product experiences, and you start to question. Obviously, a lot is going on in this video to kind of persuade these users. She's using a lot of framing in her language. She's using a lot of desirability around it. There's probably cameras around her. You're feeling on the spot. But that's not to say that we don't sometimes put participants in situations where they're on a Zoom call with 5 observers and their boss might be watching, or they just recently re-upgraded and they don't want to give you negative news. And there's a lot to really consider in how we do our research to try to get to authentic answers. But I think this is a great video to kind of showcase how easy it is to get inaccurate reporting. and how important body language and eye contact are in how we do our facilitation. Friendliness is good because it increases rapport and it opens people up, but it can also open people up to feel that they don't want to disappoint you. Okay, so we'll go into a couple more examples here. Why did you click the button on the right instead of the button on the left? It's a balanced question, so why can't we ask that one? That's hindsight bias. You've already done it. You know what it's going to do. We tend to look back on things we just learned and assume that we knew it to begin with. And so we asked about it. Sometimes we tend to unconsciously rationalize that. So you want to try to avoid asking users about things that already happened when asking them about how they feel versus things like, what do you think might happen when you click the button on the right? What do you think might happen when you click the button on the left? Another interesting study, this is an older one done on stockings. I think you know it's older because of the fact that it's stockings. But Nesbitt and Miller asked store shoppers to pick from a group of stockings the best quality pair, and they lined up a set of 4 stockings. And people could look at them, touch them, feel them, take them down. After they chose what they thought was the best pair of stockings, they were asked after the fact why they picked that pair, and they would comment on the feel or the color or the texture or the difference between them. What they didn't realize is that they were all identical. But that's not what you get from the research. What you get is the rationalization of why I made that decision after the fact. We often just do a really poor job, unfortunately, explaining and justifying our actions. And so we have to think about that with these subjective experiences and the way we ask about them. Do you use this software most of the time? It's a very common question. Interpretation bias. What is most? How often do you think I should be using this software? I use it once a year. Is that most of the time? I don't ever log into this thing. What about daily? So when describing frequency of use, trying to get more specific because you may not understand what the scale is in their head with something like most. I love this one. It's all relative. About how many meetings do you have in a week? So about, maybe a tricky word there. We're certainly not triggering the expert, but what's wrong with this one? Estimation. So looking through your calendar, how many meetings did you have this week? And was this a typical week for you? Maybe this was a weird week. So we have difficulty providing accurate answers regarding frequency and numbers. So anything we can do to get to detail and specifics is going to be good. Would you consider yourself a novice, an intermediate, or an expert? This is a tricky question. Even if you're good at what you do, this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Even if you are an expert, you tend to rate yourself lower. People who are less experienced tend to rate themselves higher. So the rating you get could be you could have your experts saying that they're intermediates, and you could have your novices saying that they're experts. It's a very tricky self-evaluation of experience. So let's go ahead and move into analysis. Availability, confirmation, and anchoring all creep into, not only have we've sampled, we've figured out who we want to ask our questions to, and then we've worked really hard to take as much bias as we can out of our questions. We've removed the ambiguous statements, we've tried to get into the details, we've tried to anchor things into real world experiences, but now it can still creep into how you interpret the results that you got from that research. So here's when I talked to 2 customers this morning, and they made a great case for adding this new feature. What's wrong with this? Availability bias. Sometimes it can be hard not to get excited when we see a finding that maybe even matches something that we're excited about and it's on point, but we have to vet those findings with a broader audience. We've got to make sure that we're looking at a high enough round of numbers to put some confidence to this. Everyone has mentioned liking the new controls, so it's looking positive. Confirmation bias. Tendency to overweight results consistent with what you think they should be. We like to see things consistent with what we already believe. Conversely, we tend to be uncomfortable with information that contradicts what we believe in or is unexpected. So we will stick to the things that we like for a number of reasons. So a better thing would be here would be encoding the data, right? So looking through, taking our data and putting it into exact numbers and then looking through the actual coding of our research to determine if we actually see this as looking positive or not, instead of starting to make those assumptions halfway through the research and then driving our biases forward. Our first participant was fantastic, and I think they really understood what we're trying to do. I think we're going to see a lot of the same. This is an example of anchoring. We've only had one participant so far, so it is too soon to speculate on outcomes. This can get tricky when you do early insight sharing. This is a tricky one to be really clear with teams, especially if I've seen teams that are really excited to get the research. And so the researcher will run a study and then post something to Slack, or run a day and then post something to Slack. And you don't want to tell the engineering team, this isn't looking good or whatever. Obviously, sometimes those Slacks can come out maybe too positive or overly anchored towards specific circumstances. And then people will make decisions based on them maybe earlier than they should. And it'll also start to affect you in your continued research, because now you've made some statements that you're more likely to ground to with your next participants. All right, and then lastly, I've just got a couple on design for any designers who might have joined the call, and it's good for researchers to know as well. The IKEA effect, attentional bias, bike shedding, I saw was on the UXRS LinkedIn recently, and the bandwagon effect. So I spent 3 months on this design. Trust me, I have thought through all the details. What could be wrong with that? Sounds like a very dedicated designer. The problem might be the IKEA effect. When you have built it, you're likely to put a disproportionate value on how good it is. So maybe a better way to look at this is I'm in the final phases, I'm narrowing down, I'm looking for feedback, external feedback of what I've done. Just because you spend a lot of time on something doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be amazing. You've got to get that outside input. I want to get this interaction just right. I could spend a few more days on it and then I'll finish the rest of the designs. That's easy to do when we really fixate on something that we think is very important. But this is attentional bias. And unfortunately, our attention is finite, as we've talked about with the robot and the expert. And ideally, we want to consider all the options and examine them fully. Maybe creating a checklist is better, working through things and time boxing them instead of overthinking or kind of rabbit holing on a particular thing, narrowing the focus too far. Before we discuss the flows, I'd like to talk about whether the primary button should be green or blue. This is our fun friend, the bike shed, what color we're going to make the bike shed. This comes from basically, I believe the original term comes from a power plant discussion, a nuclear power plant discussion, if I'm not mistaken, where as it got more complicated, less and less people understood what was going on. It went over heads. It required a lot of cognitive energy and back knowledge. And so it got to the point where so few people could have the conversation that the attention shifted to something that everyone could talk about and understand easily, which was what color do we paint the bike shed that is near the power plant. This is also, I think, a good reason why it's good to use fidelity in design and present stakeholders with wireframes and not high fidelity, because the more you add to a design, the more you're going to add to the decision making. So it goes back to reducing the number of things that people are trying to respond to. 5 of 6 competitors have a present. I'm so sorry. I was just sitting here talking and then I'm like, whoa, nobody's moving. I think something that was actually good timing then. So that's all my little quizzes that I have. I think it's fun sometimes to ask yourself, right? Though, because if I just tell you, then it's like, oh, well, that's obvious, because hindsight is obvious. But in the moment, can you think of it? I think is the more important thing. So a couple quick things. Number 1, avoid multitasking. Anytime you multitask, you're going to be calling on the robot. I know it's hard. We kind of do it all day long these days, but trying to put your Slack on focus mode, turn off the notifications, mute the phone, and try to like really pay attention to what you're doing, creating a structured approach to your work, or using something like the Pomodoro technique. Try to avoid working through important details right before the handover or time-sensitive decisions. Anytime you're rushing, again, that's going to put you into autopilot. Plan time up front. Think about your important decisions. Consider reactive versus reflective time to make sure that you're not just reacting, but you have time to really stop and think about it and give yourself space. Make sure you've eaten. Make sure you're not working on 0 glucose there. Be cynical of the audience, of the obvious. Try to think about alternate paths, alternate ways that you could get there. So anytime something seems really obvious, it can be a hint that something is automatic or autopilot and not expert consideration. If it just seems a little bit too easy, maybe you haven't considered all the use cases. And then lastly, numbers. Anytime you can bring math in, that's almost a given that you're going to go into expert mode. Data points, statistics, any evaluations, having that analysis strategy planned before you begin your research so that you're not biasing your strategy to your results. Using a coding strategy, defining your criteria and your success metrics before that research starts can be really helpful. And then lastly, get human feedback, get feedback from others, specifically diverse perspectives, get people, not the same person that you work with every single day and looks at all your stuff, because they are already going to be in tune with what you're thinking and your context and your kind of the associations, but somebody who's going to challenge your assumptions and think about critiques and things like that and workshopping to get diverse perspectives. So summary of that, avoid multitasking, avoid time-sensitive decisions, be cynical of the obvious, think statistically, and seek feedback. Okay, I can't see the chat if that's what it is. Let's see here. Let me go to the next slide. Here's a summary. You can't eliminate bias, but you can reduce it. So be careful considering your sampling, standardize your protocol, be critical of your questions and phrasings, quantify where you can, get feedback and diverse perspectives. And then a couple books. Thinking Fast and Slow is a fabulous read. I think every researcher should read it. It's got all I said and 10 bajillion times more. I'm scratching the surface of what Daniel Kahneman has researched and discovered and done with his partners and peers. But if you don't have the time for that and you're looking for more automatic processing book, You Are Not So Smart is a fantastic one by David Graney. And he also has a couple additional ones after that that are easy and fun and delightful to read. The Decision Lab is also a great website that I reference a lot. So with that, thank you very much. My favorite little GIF ever. Why is it called research? It's your first time searching for it. Get it?